The role of local governments is to provide the public infrastructure for private housing development. So instead of having the developers delivering private housing, creating more and more need for public infrastructure, what we've created is a development process that delivers all of the private housing together with all of the supporting public infrastructure. So there is no cost to council to deliver the supporting infrastructure. So instead of having that tension both in the regulatory and the public infrastructure delivery spaces, we say to the council, we will deliver the housing and all of the supporting infrastructure needed for that. So all part of the delivery process.
That was Steven Liaros, who I'm interviewing about circular economy villages. In the years that I've been researching alternative models to housing development, I've been seeing a disturbing trend of many well-designed intentional communities dying in the planning and financing stages. These are neighborhoods designed by future residents with values of sustainability, affordability, and neighbor connection, which would provide a much higher quality of life than conventionally developed neighborhoods, and have other benefits, such as ecological, economic, and social regeneration. So what is creating the untimely death of what would otherwise be a great place to live, work, and play for many people? Well, the Circular Economy Village aims to solve that problem, and that's why I think it is such an important initiative. It has identified the most common barriers to these better designed housing developments, and it provides a system, a roadmap, and solutions to these barriers, which mainly are local area planning policies, the financing, and the need for infrastructure. So by having infrastructure informed by circular economy principles, this village has a design that creates less waste and more efficiency for energy, water, waste, and roading. And because of this, then, it creates climate resilience and affordability. So the main thing is that it removes the infrastructure responsibility from the council and it makes it part of the development. The great thing also about this design, because it is meant for rural areas, is that it only uses 20% of the land for the built environment, thereby retaining the rural look, feel, and productivity, and actually perhaps increasing all three. He's looking at establishing these villages in rural and peri-urban areas where councils can see this value. He wants to work with councils that would like to help to find the land and help them to get established, because the councils see this is a better alternative to the conventional urban sprawl. To say housing development in rural areas is not the problem. What is problematic is the design of the developments and the planning rules that either allow bad design, which is quite often what we see in urban sprawl, or that don't allow good design. So in this episode, we aim to inspire you to get excited and enthused by the Circular Economy Village concept. In addition, Steven has made 2 YouTube videos that you can learn from, and we'll attach those links in the show notes. I'm recording this in September 2025. In less than 2 months, I will be hosting the Women Revolutionizing Housing Hui, or Gathering, in the top of the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is for women who want to live in such a community or who are trying to make housing change system-wise or at the community level. You can go to commonground.net.nz. Look at the tab at the top. You'll find Women Revolutionizing Housing. Find out more about the event. So now let's get on to the interview. Kia ora and welcome to the Homefulness Show. I'm your host, Zola Rose, located in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We believe housing can be a means for regenerative placemaking to create affordable and sustainable homes and neighborhoods developed in collaboration with the communities that live there. We'll be exploring different housing models and neighborhood designs and innovation in energy, water, waste, construction, land use, and food systems. We showcase housing policies, finance, funding, and community engagement to unlock this potential. This show aims to empower you with knowledge, resources, and networks to support you in creating great places to live. Come join us as we bring to life the more beautiful housing that we know is possible. Welcome, Steven, to the Homefulness Show.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Zola. The vision that we are looking at is what we're calling a network of circular economy villages. So a specific type of eco-village based on the principles of the circular economy, which include eliminating waste and pollution, keeping materials circulating, so thinking about your water cycle, your nutrient cycle, those sort of permaculture principles around food, water, energy, circulating around a live and work hub. The idea is to have a replicable process that allows us to roll out many of these villages to create a network in any environment. So that's the broad idea. We're pitching the vision and the planning policy framework. I'm a strategic town planner, so that's my background. And now we're working with investors and people who might be able to contribute, facilitate the financing of these villages.
I thought just to take a step back, which would be that question of homefulness, what would it be like to live in one of these circular economy villages, to be a person with this neighborhood or this village, and maybe take us through a day about this homefulness sense that someone living in this village would get? And what would they see? What would they hear, feel, smell? So let's paint a picture.
Okay, I might start with a little bit of a technical point to take us there in terms of what would the layout of this design be. Usually when we think of greenfield housing developments, the developer will look at the parcel of land and their ambition is how many houses can I fit on there? What we're proposing is that we have a large parcel of land and only less than 20% will have housing or built environment on it. It would be surrounded by land for agriculture, water systems, bush regeneration areas. So you're living in a more sort of country style environment. It's really about connection to that environment. For me personally, I feel, although we live at the edge of Sydney, we've traveled a bit in rural areas, and I feel most at ease when out of the city. As we drive back into the city, we feel that stress and tension of life in the city. So that's the first aspect of what the feeling would be. You would be in a more rural landscape area within a community of about 200 people on 40 hectares of land. That's the first aspect, the place you're in. In terms of the community, the idea is that those people, because of circular economy principles, they're built in, because we've built at the outset the infrastructure. By infrastructure, I mean the nature-based water systems, the agriculture systems, the energy systems. The community is then incentivized to manage those systems because in doing so, there's a reciprocal relationship. You get food, water, energy in return, and you don't have to buy it. You've bought into a place where you're not just buying housing, you're buying access to food, water, energy, internet, if that's what the community wants. Most people would want that. And access to shared electric vehicles. In this environment, it would be a live and work hub. So you can work from there. So you'd be walking to work rather than commuting. If you can work online, there's an online work hub. If you can work in agriculture, there's food systems, food processing and retail. We could have restaurants that are serving both the community itself as well as the broader community. So everything around food production, processing, and cooking. There's management of water and energy systems. In the circular economy, there's this idea of waste to resource microfactories, which is basically how do you break down the plastics and the things that are recyclable? How can you do that at a small scale within the village create sort of reuse things that would otherwise be waste to create something that might be able to be sold or may be able to be used within the village. So it's trying to create the framework for people to create their life within that, both economic opportunities and ways of self-governing. We think you need a commons governance approach. In other words, the people in the village would be self-governing and managing their common resources and infrastructure. How they do that is up to each community. Some might want a hierarchical structure, others might want a very democratic, everyone involved, everyone talking about everything all the time. That's fair enough. Each community can work out their governance system as long as it's commons-based in managing infrastructure services, if you like, the food, water, energy, which are fundamental things that everybody needs. And this is why we think about it as those basic needs: housing, food, water, energy, perhaps access to internet, shared vehicles for connecting, is something everyone needs everywhere, no matter who you are, right? So how do we plan for those things in an integrated, holistic approach?
In terms of the functionality, it would feel quite easeful to not have to drive long distances to get quite a bit of the things that people currently drive around for. Neighborliness, ease of being able to get one's other needs met, which is maybe to share some meals and connect like that, share childcare, borrow a tool, or these things that happen in everyday life that happen organically, but with the connections of a smaller village, people aren't leaving all the time, that they are around to be able to have this connection with their neighbors to get these other needs beyond the main infrastructure. And that's what I'm sensing, is that it meets the human needs all the way through, from the bigger things all the way through to the smaller things that people can actually spend a lot of energy also trying to figure out. Like childcare is one of them that a lot of families have to juggle a lot. In a smaller community where people are more connected, that can just be a lot quicker of a process. And then parents are freed up, and everybody would be freed up, really, if all those little minor things are more easeful, to be more stress-free in their bodies and in their interactions, and then have more time to access the well-being parts of their lives.
Yeah, I think if you think about it as a neighborhood community, it's not about there's gates around this and you're fenced off and you're locked in that community. Open, permeable boundary community, like your local neighborhood. Instead of fences, there are more opportunities for connection and sharing everyday relationships around even things like childcare and aged care that we've commodified now. In traditional communities, that was done organically. We've structured our lives around driving to work, spending all day working to earn as much money as possible to do all the things we haven't had time to do because we're working all day. And so how do we free up that time and work more collaboratively as a community? Perhaps instead of thinking of the household as the basic unit, we think of the community as the basic unit of society.
I think a lot of our planning rules are around the individual. It's about one house and managing it from a unit thinking rather than a holistic way of thinking. So that's where you were trying to address the planning and helping planners to understand how it differs, but yet the massive benefit of doing it differently. I appreciate that you've come from a planning background. That has been the biggest stumbling block of a lot of ideas. I think the circular economy village, where you've got the housing and the economy and the food and the energy, water, waste, all of those important things that people need around them, can be found in other projects, but they're like once-offs. Probably 90% of those projects with fantastic values and positive impact outcomes don't meet the light of day because they don't have that planning framework, which provides for the financing framework. And I think where this project is so strong is that it's got that planning framework. And with Nilmini, we haven't talked about your partner, but with that engineering background and the local government background that you both have. And that's where you've honed in on we're going to unlock the biggest place. But these values get buried when they hit local governments planning or the resource development acts or similar zoning. And this is where you've made your project more accessible to the powers that hold the reins on innovative housing development. And you are looking to unlock this area.
That's exactly right. I've come from a strategic planning background involved in greenfield subdivision developments on the edge of our cities, as well as inner city development. And I started to realize as far back as 2012 that there were fundamental problems. It wasn't delivering good quality or affordable housing for people. It was no longer feasible already back then for developers to deliver high quality outcomes. And councils and the government wasn't able to provide the necessary supporting infrastructure. We started looking for other ideas and quickly came across eco-villages, and we visited many across Europe, Australia. We didn't get to the US or New Zealand. And what we realized is exactly what you said, that the intention is there. We arrive at this idea of an eco-village fairly intuitively. A lot of people arrive at the idea. So that's understandable. But we came across the same figures. 90% never get off the ground. The ones that do can take 10 years. We realized that having the skills we had, that's the contribution we could make. How do you build those ideas into existing planning and financing processes? How do you bridge that gap between what communities are asking for and what the development industry is actually delivering? And really, over the last 10 years, over that period that we've been looking at it, those two sides have come together a lot more. A lot more eco-villages are working through the planning process, but also a lot of developers are creating much more livable environments. Renewable energy in the system is increasingly part of it, water-sensitive urban design, some community gardens. But the gap is still quite significant. Both sides are trying, but the gap is significant. I think that's where we've tried to focus our attention.
That's what very much appeals to me. And I'd love for more local governments to listen to this, because I know that that's who you're appealing to get on board, that it's a collaborative approach. It's not just about the people who want to live in that kind of community. Really, I believe your messaging is that you're trying to get local governments to come on board to be full collaborators, because a housing community or a village of this type eliminates many of the problems that they're currently spending a lot of money on, or that are just concerning to them from a well-being perspective. So if we can get local government to see this as a win for them, save them in a long run so many of the costs that they have on infrastructure or on other well-being things that a lot of not-for-profits also spend a lot of money on, this really does serve them to collaborate with the developer and future residents that want to be involved in that process. And as we were saying, that what differentiates this model from an eco-village model, which is often resident-led or developer profit-led, that we're looking at a biophilic or a landscape, a nature-based leading. What is it that this region calls for, the land calls for, and it quite often is indigenous in its way of thinking about how to be in place, how to be in land without disturbing too much. And in fact, we're harmony, where there's a working reciprocal relationship with the environment, developing from that perspective. That's what I appreciate about your model, that it can be developer-led, but the developer is really informed and driven by the regenerative values and how is it going to be to live in place, rather than what do I get out of it as a developer when I leave. And most likely, I suspect your developers will be future residents as well. They'll want to live in the places they've developed.
Yes, absolutely. So landscape-led design is certainly a key point of difference, I feel, from the community-led approaches of most eco-villages. Not to say that's not valid and appropriate, and there certainly would be community involvement in the co-design process of certain aspects of it. But when you are looking at working with a piece of land. And this is informed by Indigenous ideas, and certainly in Australia, of country-led design. The land teaches people the law, is the way they phrase it. We don't impose our will on the land. The land tells us what it needs. Water will fall along gullies, and if you can create reservoirs, enhance that sort of constructed creek line, create constructed wetlands that mimic natural systems, and then use renewable energy to cycle water back to the top of the hill to flow back through to create that natural water cycle in a place, you're actually enhancing the natural systems in order to sustain the population that's going to live there. And so water is life, right? So once you've got that local energy system with renewables and you can circulate water, you can grow more food. And then again, with the food, the land will tell you what grows there. Each area has its own climatic conditions, geographic conditions, orientation, and so on that influence what foods can grow in a particular place. And when thinking of it as a network of villages, each village has its own. Most places you can grow your basic vegetables, for example, but to have grain, you need flat land. So certain areas would be able to grow that grain. Other areas would be able to grow rainforest fruits. So it depends on where you're located as to what your primary food would be produced. But a collaborative network can trade between them the things that they lack. So that country-led, landscape-led design, enhancing the landscape to sustain the population in each place is core to how we see this.
Mm-hmm. Is there any community or neighborhoods you visited where it felt similar to how it would feel being in a circular economy village that exists now?
Yeah, there's one called Lochiel Park in Adelaide, which was led by the state-owned developer. And that has the nature-based water systems very well developed. So constructed wetlands. They also have a community garden and renewable energy built into the system. The Cape in Cape Patterson, which is in Victoria, east of Melbourne, has taken the energy design and the food production locally to another level. So they have an on-site farmer and a lot of local food production happening, lots of open space, connection to the nearby surf beach. The energy system is well designed in minimizing energy demand in the buildings themselves, as well as generating a lot of energy. So a lot of the households there don't pay any energy bills. And maybe the other one I could mention is north of Sydney, Narara Eco Village. Started as a community-led project and very much has worked within the existing planning systems and has really advanced a lot of the community-led design approaches. They have food production and a water system. So those three are the ones I would mention, at least from the Australian context.
I think that's helpful for people to be able to visit one of these places, talk with the residents, and get a feel for what it is like to be there. I was in Narara, and for me, it was a game changer. I was there for only 3 days, and the feeling that the neighbors had of how well their community was working in so many different ways. I was welcomed in. They were very happy to have visitors and welcome me. And I also found that they were very proud of the fact that they're very impact oriented. So they're an eco village with mission. And so it's not just a place to live. People who are attracted to the mission to make things better. They have goals, even quantitative standards by which they're trying to improve. And I think people like to be able to see that, wow, we're living in this place that is working towards these. And then every resident can see, where's my part to play in any one of these missions? And
Yeah.
it was really nice to walk around and feel
Yeah.
that kind of neighborhood.
Yeah, I think what you described there is really important. All of us want to feel valued for what we can contribute. And if someone or a village or place is offering that vision and asking people actively, what do you want to contribute? How can you add value? What skills can you bring to make this a better place? Then that builds a strong connection between the community and the individual. And that's something that a lot of people are looking for. How do I get away from doing what I have to do what I love and can be valued for by a community?
Yeah, I think people wanted opportunity to have contribution, and that just makes it that much easier rather than feeling stressed and strained. That
Exactly.
contribution is integrated into the living. I wanted to step back and understand where you got this idea, which culminated in a PhD, maybe even going back to your childhood or early years. What was it that sort of built this in you to get to the point where you've now done this project and you're moving it on? What has been those catalyzing parts of your history?
It's actually a number of various threads of my life. There was one phase that was particularly impactful. I was working for local government for 17 years. Then a merger happened, and it felt like that loyalty and that contribution was suddenly irrelevant. And this sort of permeated through various aspects of my life where it felt like the people in power were not interested. They were just interested in more power. They weren't interested in the common good. And so this also played out with the global financial crisis, where the banks were bailed out, but people were left to hang. The climate talks, where we've been talking most of my life about action on climate change, and it's just talk, and there's no action for the common good. And I kind of realized that people have to mobilize to create change. We can't rely on governments or corporations that are not concerned about the common good, whether reflected in inequality, social injustices, or environmental issues. It was some of the things I learned by doing town planning. I started off as an engineer, actually, and when I studied planning, I had come from a much more conservative background. When I was exposed to issues of social inequality and environmental consequences of the actions that we're doing, I started to realize that I needed to broaden my perspective in terms of how to be in the world. And so, without being too specific, that was the gem for me about things, the common good. How do we advance the common good? It has to be the people in the commons who are doing it, right? It can't be relying
Mhm.
on centralized authorities. That's how I ended up in that space.
What I'm hearing, the things that resonated with you, the values that you were holding around social justice, care for the environment, a sense of agency for people who are living in place, and the common good thinking
Mm,
rather than an I or a me thinking is what you
mm.
really have the underpinnings of this model.
Well, this is actually borne out in the literature around the commons and the idea of tragedy of the commons, that we're in a system where inevitably we will damage all of the commons. And so the first thing I say to that is, why do we think we're trapped? We shouldn't be trapped in a system. We should be able to be free to explore new systems. But in that commons literature, your listeners will be familiar with Elinor Ostrom's idea of managing the commons. The conclusion of all her research is that if we rely on external authorities to manage our commons, they will be damaged. But if the community itself is managing its own common resources, then they will be cared for. That comes out in Indigenous thinking of care for country, the intuitive need to look after our land and the people in our community is borne out in the literature.
Thank you. I'm also driven by caring for the commons and having agency within that. So local government is in charge of the commons, but I remember in one of your presentations that it's often preserving of the private. So the commons we might think of for the public, and housing is actually more of a private kind of thing. And yet the infrastructure and all the things that the council's kind of looking after, it really is serving in a private kind of way, right? Those in their homes and needing to get around. And I'm wanting to go to where the local government can think differently on supporting the development of a circular economy village. This isn't for an inner city or for intensification or densification of a city. And that is important for people who want to be in a city. But as you've said, not everybody feels that that's where they're meant to be. And we also already have people living in rural areas who want to stay there, but economically it's not working for them anymore. Maybe there isn't housing for them. And that's where we have this conflict of population growth and infrastructure. We can't afford to keep sprawling suburbia. It's going to cost too much. So we've got a need to develop our rural or regional areas. Local governments only understand the current status quo, which is that more development takes more infrastructure, which they don't have the money for. So if we can frame this, let's now direct it to either people who want to advocate to their local government, hear this concept of a circular economy village and say, yes, I'm behind it. This is what I want in my regional rural area. And then to those councils looking after these areas, let's message this them and to people like me that really want to advocate what are the benefits and how is it that we can actually make this happen. I'd like to take a brief moment to share with you about Common Ground, the consulting agency to provide professional services to enable more affordable, socially connected, resilient, and climate-adaptive housing and neighborhood development and place-based living. Common Ground works with local government, with community housing providers, with for-purpose developers, and with groups of people wishing to lead their own housing initiatives. We provide services in housing strategy, design and facilitation of meaningful community engagement, research, policy development, training in new approaches to better housing outcomes. We also provide services in workplace culture and communication to create more cohesive and effective working teams and workplaces. You can visit our website at commonground.net.nz to learn more about our services and the Community Land Trust model, and please sign up for our weekly newsletter for inspirational resources, links to case studies that showcase successful initiatives and policies, and get announcements to upcoming events.
So we think of local government from this perspective of how do we develop a circular economy village. There are two separate roles that local governments have. So the first is a regulatory role. Think about the activities, for example, the relationship between a developer and the council is essentially antagonistic, right? The developer is seeking to maximize what they can do, which maximizes the impact on surrounding residents and communities. And the council, from that regulatory perspective, is trying to protect the local community, to conserve the natural environment. So there's this tension between the developer maximizing, and that's how we think about environmental conservation, where we're protecting against the inevitable advance of private interests. So the public interest is to protect against that. So instead of having that antagonistic relationship, we want to develop a collaborative relationship with the council. The role of local governments is to provide the public infrastructure for private housing development. So instead of having the developers delivering private housing as much as possible, creating more and more need for public infrastructure, what we've created is a development process that delivers all of the private housing together with all of the supporting public infrastructure. So there is no cost to council to deliver the supporting infrastructure. The way we work it is through what's called, in New South Wales at least, a voluntary planning agreement, which is an agreement that the developer will deliver certain infrastructure by agreement with the council. So instead of having that tension both in the regulatory and the public infrastructure delivery spaces, we say to the council, we will deliver the housing and all of the supporting infrastructure needed for that. So the water systems that we talked about, the energy systems, the connecting roads are all part of the delivery process. So that's where we try to deliver in locations that council believes strategically would benefit from. In some of the attractive locations that we were working in, attractive to people to come and move there, is that the local essential workers have been priced out. People from the cities are coming and working from home or putting the houses on Airbnb. And so local businesses are suffering because there's all these people from the cities working from home, taking up all the housing that's available. So the contribution we feel we can make to some of these rural communities is that we can provide housing for the essential workers of the area.
Great. And what I'm hearing is that you're able with the local council to say, we're taking a bunch off your plate, but in exchange, you need to modify the way you understand rural development. So rural development being one house per so many hectares, because they want to keep productive land or rural character. But the circular economy village does that inherently. It already provides for, because it's got a dense living area in terms of the built environment, the whole area still is probably 75% still used in that rural way, whether it be agriculture or some other biological, ecological function or nature in general. That's embedded within development, counter to current planning policy for a rural area. But by doing that, densifying the housing, one then can still get that outcome that council wants out of how a rural area would be developed without all the extra costs of bringing the infrastructure. So in terms of a council coming on board, it's a no-brainer that the council would be, wow, this solves a lot of our problems. So what would those challenges be that a council would perceive why they couldn't just do it?
We don't see anything as an obstacle that eliminates the possibility. We see challenges that need to be overcome. And we've worked with different councils. In some councils, there's enough unused farmland close to villages. We could deliver a dozen circular economy villages. In other areas, the land is constrained. One, Bellingen has a lot of national parks, state parks, bushland that we want to protect. Bellingen Village is nestled in very productive agricultural land that needs to be protected for that purpose, and other natural activities. So there isn't actually a lot of places there that could be used for an additional village. So it varies from place to place depending on existing conditions and constraints. The other obstacles are we don't have the provisions in the planning schemes to allow for this to happen, and particularly on rural land, which is protected for rural activities. So we need to negotiate an amendment to those schemes, planning instruments, and planning policies that would allow for that to happen. And planning really is only the first step. There's a whole lot of water management regulations. There's health regulations in terms of food production and processing on site. There's energy regulations around how you manage your energy system. This is what we would call a microgrid. So there's energy regulations as well that need to be overcome. So there's challenges to be faced and addressed, but I wouldn't call them obstacles that would prohibit it being done. They're obstacles that we've created through regulation that can be managed if you're focused on delivering the outcome that you want for communities and for the environment.
That's right. Yes, and I've spoken to people who've said rules should serve people rather than people serving rules. Where a rule stops being beneficial, we need to look at the rules rather than continuing to just push these rules beyond their usefulness. So if I were to want to approach my local council, you've got some presentations already created. One talks about a systemic, holistic way of thinking, a regenerative way of thinking. The other has aspects of the project, which is a bit longer. So that would be helpful for me to start helping others to understand the basic concepts. What might be the next step? What are the strategies to get my council on board?
This is the challenge we're tackling. Most regional councils that we've engaged with are comfortable supporting those changes that need to be made. But allowing for something, permitting sort of development is not the same as actually getting it on the ground, which needs the financing. And I think that is the key challenge that we're looking at now. We've created a financial strategy. It's not a detailed business plan, but a broad framework that builds on the community land trust model. For those who don't know, community land trusts are about community ownership of the land in perpetuity, the land on which a co-housing or eco-village type development would happen. It's owned in perpetuity by this community-owned land trust. And in most land trusts, individuals lease that land from the community or access that land in some way to build their own private house. In our model, the land trust would own all the land and improvements, buildings and infrastructure. People would access the village through a rental agreement. Through one agreement, you get access to housing, food, water, energy, internet, shared vehicles, and so on. That's the broad intention. The equity, the ownership of the village is owned by the residents. But the residents are unlikely to have all the money needed upfront. So we need development and debt financing from investors. And so that's the pitch that we're currently working on to different investors to pitch to them potential pipeline of circular economy villages in regional areas that they can invest in. And so there's a few people that we're talking with now that may be able to assist us in that. We'll see how that sort of plays out. But they're two sort of parallel and necessary processes, the planning policy and the financing. And the financing will never work if there isn't a planning policy in place that allows it to happen. So that needs to happen in parallel. When investors see approval that it can deliver housing and there's demand for that kind of housing, then they will invest. We're working on now that investment vehicle, if you want to call it that, what investors call it, that will allow or will provide for the financing for a network of villages.
Hearing three key things that need to happen simultaneously. The one is engaging with the local government around the regulatory policy, zoning, that kind of thing. The other one is the community land trust model, that ownership tenure model, and setting that up, which needs to be done. Usually it's a collaboration between a council with other not-for-profits that create a trust board so that it has that community governance. And then we've got the financing so that investors are having that security of tenure through the CLT ownership model, and then knowing that it's going to have a bit of a smooth flow with getting things onto the ground, because that's where quite often the expense can come in if there's holdup in the regulatory process. If there's any sort of a bank lending at all, there's that the interest that starts to accumulate on any of that land or if rates need to be paid. So for investors to have their security, it's the CLT ownership as well as the regulatory and planning. I'm happy to hear that you've got those three well thought out and underway. The financing is the other big stumbling block. And I think a return on investment, one usually hears about housing being an investment and the return, but I'm wondering that would be really interesting to know if there's another kind of group of investors that are just not focused on having that solid 10% financial return, but if there are investors that perhaps are willing to take a smaller return over a longer period of time because they really do have the bigger picture impact outcomes, that's what they're wanting to invest in. Are you finding investors like that out there?
There are investors out there, and we're told that there's a lot of money available for social and environmental impact investment. It's all about return on investment and the risks associated with any individual investment. So in the development space, there's risk around the construction process. And in that case, we're talking about construction finance 12% and upwards to get that kind of financing. But what we're seeing also is a shift to speculative development financing to build to rent projects. Build to rent is a model where the developer builds and then doesn't sell the individual units, they rent them on an ongoing basis. The incentive is to create lower operating costs, and that kind of aligns much more sustainability objectives. You want something that's durable, you don't want it low cost that breaks down and requires regular maintenance. You want something that will be low maintenance over the long term and offers a passive long-term return on investment. Build to rent finance is generally much lower than speculative construction financing. That's one shift in the development industry. There's energy finance from the authorities trying to drive the energy transition. And I know Narara, for example, got financed through ARENA in Australia. And so there's that, but there's also the future residents. When you're building your own home, it's not a development project seeking a return on investment. If future residents put up some finance as equity that will buy them access to the finished product, essentially zero cost finance. So all about how do we balance the construction finance, the kind of 4, 5, 6% lower cost, lower returns for long-term investment versus the equity from future residents. Those are the three categories in the financing model. And it's starting to become a project around promoting a new great Australian dream instead of individual home ownership, where we're looking at how do we have collective ownership and collect of communities. And so there's a marketing promotion of this idea. How do we get the word out there? Something that people want, and therefore there's demand for it, which will drive the supply on the other side.
Yeah, and I like the idea that if there's a network of these communities spread across the country, there's mobility. People fear the CLT model. I get asked if I sell the house I own on the CLT, where can I go after that? I won't have gotten this big gain while everything else around me has risen in price. We need to think longer term. If we've got a range of these communities, people can have that choice to move around the country and still have a similar place to live in both value systems and the way that it's set up, but also financially making that work.
You can rent initially and not invest anything. So it's a kind of try and see if you like it type environment. And then you can buy shares or units in the trust that can reduce your rent and give you timeshare access to one or more villages. There might be a membership in parallel where you're a member of the network of villages and move from place to place. I'm particularly interested in the balance between settled life and nomadic life and the ability to move from place to place is when you see the explosion of caravans and camper vans around the country, particularly in the last few years, it tells you that living is not necessarily always in community on land. It can be traveling between. If you've got connection to the internet, you can work from anywhere. Some people may want a more nomadic life to experience different places, or we might have different life stages where I'm in a nomadic phase for a year or two, and I found the place where I really want to be and where I'm valued, so I'll stay here for a while.
Yeah, that particularly appeals to me because I am more of a nomadic person. So the idea that I could land in a place and kind of have instant community, then that's an amazing mix that you've got some people who are strongly rooted and others who are rooted more in a value system and a way of being rather than in actually only the place itself. So I hear that you've really looking to make that circular economy village for intergenerational living as well as place-based and integrating some of the nomadic style that we see more of. Books, YouTube channels, podcasts, or other resources that have inspired you, that have influenced you, that you can recommend that people read and learn from. And you've written so much. So I'm making a link to your website and YouTube channel. But if there's anything else additionally that you would recommend, you can give that to me. I'll include those links. Was there anything else you wanted to end on? Any final words?
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work we've done. Just go back to that question of not being trapped in the current system, not feeling trapped, that there are alternative ways of living that we can imagine and then build. If you can imagine it, you can make it real. I'm thinking of a fundamental paradigm shift in the way that we live, not incremental adjustments, targets for 2050 or whatever else. Let's reimagine and then rebuild. That's why I talk about rethinking the city.
Yes, and the city then can turn into a hamlet for those who don't like cities, but who still like a lot of the aspects of what city life amenities. We can have that in a hamlet style out in a rural or
I
regional
mean,
area.
a network of
And
hamlets. So
better.
villages instead of piling everyone into the one place.
Yes. And again, going back to what I really love about this concept is that you are tackling the hardest bits. You've made the planning, legality, ownership model, and the financing, those three pieces of greatest challenge for these projects. You have identified and you've spelled it out, and you are showing how it can be done. So this project for me has immense potential. I want everybody to know about it, particularly all the local governments that can be enabling, particularly investors where they can play their part. We've got all of your roadmap that we can take off the shelf. There's a lot you've made available for others to use. And that's so generous of you and Nilmini to do that.
Thanks very much, Zola. I appreciate it.